Welcome to Back to the Bible. Today, pastor and Bible teacher Bryan Clark takes you to the book of James for an insightful look at how to persevere through trials and temptations. He'll also answer questions and offer practical tips as he joins Arnie Cole and Kara Whitney in studio later in the program. Now let's go to Bryan Clark with today's study.
Nobody gets up in the morning, says, "Hey, I think today I'll ruin my life. This looks like a good day to make a mess of everything." But every day, people make disastrous choices that make a mess of their lives. Why is that? That's what we want to talk about. If you have a Bible, turn with us to James chapter 1. I can't imagine a subject that's more practical than the subject of temptation. The text in James is perhaps the most insightful and the most practical on the topic of temptation in the entire New Testament. Verse 12 is kind of a hinge verse. It hinges from the previous text into the text that we're going to talk about today. I want to pick it up in verse 12. "Blessed is a man who perseveres under trial. For once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him." Blessed, deeply happy. Very similar to what's said in verse 2, the fullness of joy. Deeply happy is the man who what? Perseveres under trial. How do we persevere under trial? By building endurance. How do we build endurance? Through trials. For once he has been approved. The idea of approval here is not the idea that this one's approved and this one's not. Carries more the idea that it's the revealing of what's there. So what Christ has done for us is revealed through the trials and through the struggles. Often the New Testament refers to them as the fires of life. It's an imagery of the refining fires, and the gold comes to the surface and the dross is removed. It's revealing or exposing what's true of us. He will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. The crown is not a crown like a kingly crown. That's a completely different Greek word. This is a word that means a wreath, typically given to an athlete who wins a particular event. Throughout the New Testament, it refers to multiple crowns, but I think they all mean the same thing. They all mean the fulfillment or the completion of our salvation. The crown of life is the reward at the end of the race. It's life. It's life eternal. It's Genesis 2 life. It's what God always intended. And then it's reference to those who love him, which is just language that refers to those who have experienced God's salvation. It's not a condition of salvation, it's the outflow of salvation. The New Testament knows nothing of this concept of 1, 2, 3 points and a ticket to heaven. What it does know is that through Jesus' finished work on the cross, it is possible to have our sins forgiven and to enter into a lifelong, passionate, eternal relationship with God. And so the language is often in reference to relationship. So salvation is those who love him, who will ultimately receive the fulfillment, the completion of their salvation, which is life unlike we've ever known it. Now that comes back in verse 18 and kind of provides the bookends to this particular text. Verse 13, "Let no one say when he is tempted." That seems like a rather abrupt transition. It's not as abrupt, though, as it seems. Interestingly enough, the one Greek word is translated both trial and temptation. So whenever you see that in your New Testament, it's the same Greek word. It's simply the context that determines whether the translation here is a trial or a testing or it's a temptation. Now, in this case, in verse 2 and verse 12, James uses the noun, and it's translated trial or temptation. Verse 13 switches to the verb, which gives us just a little hint that his meaning in this word has changed just a little bit in this next section. Even though the concepts of a trial and a temptation are different, I would not say they're unrelated. We might say they're cousins. Because oftentimes in the midst of a trial, if we respond poorly, that makes us very vulnerable to temptation. So there's definitely a link, and that's kind of the flow of the text here. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. So let's define the word temptation. I would define the word temptation as the solicitation, the offer to meet a legitimate need through illegitimate means. It's the solicitation, the offer to meet a legitimate need through illegitimate means. Now, it's very important to understand that because at the core of every temptation is a legitimate need. Nobody's questioning that. Nobody's doubting that. If we camp on this idea that it's a legitimate need, therefore that makes it okay for me, that's where we get ourselves into trouble. We're thinking, well, this isn't really bad because this is a legitimate need, so I have a legitimate expectation that that need should be met. Nobody's questioning whether or not that's a legitimate need. We understand that. The question is whether you're going to meet that need through legitimate means, which is God's way, or illegitimate means, which is my way. That's really where the problem is. That's where the battle is. If I start to think this is about a legitimate need, and that's the point, then I rationalize. Then I make excuses. Then I figure out some reason why, for me, in this case, it's okay because that need should be met. And I fail to see the end of the definition. The question is not whether or not it should be met, it's whether it's my way or God's way. So what the text says is God never tempts us. There is never a case where God dangles this bait in front of our nose to see whether we're going to take it or not. This isn't a game to him. He doesn't play that game. He never tempts us with evil. The text tells us that God himself cannot be tempted with evil. Now, there's lots of reasons for that. It's because of the character of God. He can't violate his own nature. His nature is righteousness and holiness. It's because God sees the beginning from the end. He knows the whole story. How could you fool him? How could you deceive him? But at the core, it's because God has no lack. If you think back to our definition, God has no need. God has no lack. There's nothing this world or anyone else could offer him that he doesn't already have. Therefore, he's not temptable. The scriptures tell us that Jesus in his incarnation was tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin. The text is clear that God is not tempted by evil, nor does he turn around and tempt us with evil.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, visit backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org. Now let's return to our study in James chapter 1. Here again is Bryan Clark.
Verse 14. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Verses 14 and 15 are critically important to understand. We are tempted when we are carried away and enticed by our own lust. The two phrases, carried away and enticed, are fishing and hunting terms. The idea of carried away is the idea of luring something out of its hiding place, where it was safe, out to where it's vulnerable. So you might think of a call or a decoy or something like that. The idea of enticed is to bait a hook or to bait a trap. The metaphor of fishing makes the most sense to me because the essence of fishing is deception. To be a good fisherman, you have to be a good liar. Now, we're only lying to the fish, but that is what we're doing. We're taking something, We're putting it on a hook, and we're saying to the fish, if you eat this, it's really good. Not only is it good, it's really good for you. That's a lie. He's about to get a hook in the face. But the art of fishing is the art of deception. And in both the Old and New Testament, that imagery is used consistently for the idea of temptation. The enemy comes along and baits a trap, baits a hook, and seeks to convince us this is good, and it's good for you. The question we would ask is, what is it that the enemy is putting on the hook? What is it that he puts in the trap to bait us? And the text answers the question. We are enticed by our own lust. If your translation has the plural, lusts, that is incorrect, and it's an unfortunate translation. This is not talking about all the different lusts that are out there that face us. We think about sexual lust and all this, and so then everybody's thinking about their own deal. All of those flow out of one core issue, and that is the lust. That is the desire. It's the core issue that makes us vulnerable to temptation. That's what James is talking about here. This is exactly the same way that John uses this concept in 1 John chapter 2, verse 16. When he's defining this world, he says, this world is made up of the lust of the flesh. The idea of the flesh is that which I can do apart from God. There's a lot of good that's done in the flesh. All religion is done in the flesh. It's that which I can do without God. In other words, it's that which I can do myself. So the idea of the flesh is I can do this myself. The lust of the flesh is referring to a desire I have deep down within me to do this myself. I can meet my own need. I can take care of myself. I can run my life. I can do this. Every single one of us deep down have this desire to be our own God and to run our own lives. And that's ultimately what temptation appeals to. To understand this, we have to go all the way back to Genesis 3. The correlation between the temptation narrative in Genesis 3 and what's recorded in James 1 is striking. In Genesis chapter 3, the discussion starts related to the goodness of God. Adam and Eve were perfect in every way. They were perfect in their relationship with God. They were perfect in their relationship to one another. They were in a perfect environment that God himself defined as paradise. That raises the question, how do you tempt somebody that literally has it all? The answer is you seek to convince them there's still more. As good as this is, there's still more. And that starts with a discussion related to the goodness of God. God isn't as good as you think he is. You think God's generous, but God has really said you can't eat from these trees, so he's actually restrictive. So that's where the discussion starts, and we'll come to that in James in just a couple of minutes. It moves to the lie that there are no real consequences to disobeying God. You shall not die. And then it gets to the real essence of the issue. You can be like God, knowing good and evil. Now, not knowing good and evil experientially, because God has never known evil experientially. It's referring to the fact that God defines good and evil. God makes the rules. And so the lie from the serpent to Adam and Eve is you can be like God. You can decide what's right and wrong. You can decide what's good and evil. You can run your own life. And if you do that, as good as this is, it will be better, because life is always better with you in charge of your own life. In essence, you can be your own God. Adam and Eve think that sounds really good. They take the bait, and everything comes crashing down. That's exactly the same usage that James has when he refers to our own lust, the deep desire within us to be our own God, to decide for ourselves what is right and wrong, to call our own shots. Certainly, I would be happier if I was in charge. Certainly, life would be better if I was running the show. I have this need. It's a legitimate need, but it's going unmet. Therefore, if I was in charge, I would meet that need, and that would make me happier. That's the idea of lust. Probably the greatest temptation all of us face as people made in the image of God is the temptation to think, I can be my own God. I can somehow make my life more. And so that is the core issue out of which flows all other issues. Whether I'm talking about the temptation to say something, the temptation to be arrogant, to be prideful, the temptation towards sexual immorality, the temptation to be selfish, whatever the temptation is, whatever that lust is, it comes all the way back to this one core issue. I'm tempted to be my own God and to do it my way. Verse 15, then when lust has conceived. The English translation doesn't use the word the, but it's important to understand the Greek actually reads in verse 15, then when the lust has the definite article there. Again, it confirms the idea that this is talking about the core issue, the lust, out of which all other flows. Then when the lust has conceived. James is going to use a powerful birth analogy. Everybody understands that life begins at conception. When a husband and wife come together, a child is conceived. James is saying that's where temptation starts. It starts at the point of conception. There is a thought that enters into my mind to meet a legitimate need my own way. I start to think about certain behavior, a certain attitude, a certain response. Whatever it is, there's this thought that's been conceived where I would like to do this. There's something deep inside that conceives of this. That is the point at which temptation must be dealt with.
Now Bryan Clark joins us in the studio with Back to the Bible CEO Arnie Cole and author Kara Whitney.
Bryan, I personally have done a lot of study on temptation, and yet I'm still amazed at the tremendous power that temptation has of people of all ages and all walks of life. Tell me, what's happening at the deepest level when we're being tempted?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it takes us back to Genesis 3. And really reminds us at the core is the question, do I trust God and do I believe God is good? So it's the invitation to meet a legitimate need, but am I going to trust God with that need? Or am I going to do it myself? So I seek to meet the need through illegitimate means. So at the core is always the question, can I trust God? Does he tell the truth?
If we're under trial, is that a perfect time for temptation to rear its ugly head?
Yeah, I think it certainly can be, especially if we've bought into a let's make a deal theology, and I've been a really good boy, and everything's fallen apart, and I'm going through a trial, and now I feel like God didn't keep his promise, God's not good, God's not faithful, I can't trust him. You can hear it in the language. I'm really in a very vulnerable place in my life if I'm going to trust him to meet a legitimate need, but I'm feeling like I can't trust him. He let me down. He's not going to be there for me. Then it's very common. Then I'll be my own God and I'll meet this need myself. But I think it's also true, kind of the other side of the coin, is it's often in trials when we're most aware of our need for God.
So we're really dialed into God's presence and our need for him. So it can work the other way. Instead of making me vulnerable, it sometimes just makes me more dialed in, more aware, more committed to God because my need is so great.
Your definition of lust was really helpful today. It sounds like it's different, though, for each one of us.
Yeah, there's the same and then there's different. So that clears it right up, doesn't it?
Yeah, perfectly.
So the lust, which is how James uses it, and it's also how John uses it when he talks about the lust of the flesh, is a reference to the core lust all the way back to Genesis 3, and that is this desire as a person made in the image of God to be my own God. All sin roots back to that key lust. Whenever I give in to temptation, whenever I sin, it always comes back to my determination to be my own God. I'll do this myself. But then he also talks about enticing, which is a fishing term, actually. And it's about baiting a hook. And the enemy knows what bait to put on your hook. Just like when you go fishing, you don't use the same thing for every fish.
Right.
And so it does get very specific to you and to me as to what I'm likely to pursue. What's the bait that's going to get me to take the hook?
Right. We all have different weaknesses. So.
Yeah, and things that tempt you maybe wouldn't tempt me at all. And things that tempt me wouldn't tempt you at all. So we are unique that way.
Ultimately, what's the difference between a trial and a temptation?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And in the New Testament Greek, it's the same word. So the translators have to figure out based on the context which it is. So there is a linkage to the two. But generally speaking, a trial is a hardship and adversity. Sometimes I bring it on myself. Sometimes it's just living in a fallen world. And God uses it to reveal my faith or to purify my faith. Temptation is the solicitation toward evil. It's the invitation to meet a legitimate need through illegitimate means. So God allows us to go through trials. Sometimes maybe he even puts them together for our own good, but he would never solicit us toward evil.
Okay.
Thanks for taking time to be with us today. If you'd like to listen to this message again, please visit us at backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more of Bryan Clark's teaching, right here on Back to the Bible. To listen again or find out more about our speakers, come to backtothebible.org.